Story 1. Mike's Disappearance. Back in the fall of '87, a few of my friends and I went through one of the most harrowing experiences that any of us can recount. I was 38 then, a seasoned hunter with years of trekking through forests under my belt. That year, I went on a hunting trip with 3 buddies of mine, Rick, Jonah, and Mike, to a remote cabin deep in the woods. It was a rugged, isolated place, perfect for a few days of hunting and camaraderie. But what transpired turned our excursion into a chilling ordeal that none of us were prepared for. We arrived at the cabin on a nice October afternoon. The place was a simple, rustic affair, with just enough comforts to make it habitable for a few days. We unpacked, settled in, and planned our hunting routes. The forest around us was a sprawling expanse of old-growth trees and dense underbrush, the kind of wilderness that makes you feel both insignificant and alive. The first 2 days went by without incident. We would set out at dawn, split up to cover more ground, and rendezvous back at the cabin by sunset. On the 3rd day, however, things took a dark turn. Mike, always the most adventurous of us, decided to venture further into the forest, eager to track down a deer he had spotted. We agreed to meet back at the cabin by dusk, but dusk came and went, and there was no sign of Mike. The later it got, the more panic set in. Rick, Jonah, and I grabbed a little bit of gear and some flashlights and set out to look for him, foolishly leaving our guns behind. The forest at night was a different beast entirely. Sounds were amplified, and shadows played tricks on your eyes. We retraced Mike's planned route and called out for him, but got nothing back. Hours passed, and our initial worry turned into genuine fear. It was creeping up on midnight, and our calls for him went unanswered. Finally, just when we were beginning to believe that all hope was lost, we found him. He was slumped up against a large tree, dazed and confused, bleeding from one of his temples. His hunting rifle and backpack were gone. He had little memory of what had happened, only a vague recollection of being struck from behind and losing consciousness. Relieved but deeply unsettled, we decided to head back to the cabin and call for help at first light. However, as we approached the cabin, a sinking feeling took hold. The door was smashed open. Inside, the place had been ransacked. Our supplies, guns, and gear were all gone. Even the trucks outside had been broken into. It was clear that we weren't alone in these woods. A person, or a group of people, had been watching us, waiting for the opportunity to strike. It was a terrifying thought to think about. We were out in the middle of nowhere, with no guns and no protection against people with dark intentions. The realization that they had taken Mike out and used our search as a chance to ransack our cabin frightened us to the core. We were vulnerable, exposed, and miles from the nearest help. Luckily for us, both Jonah and I had our truck keys on us at the time that we went searching for Mike. Had we not, we might have been stuck in the woods with no way out, assuming that these individuals would have taken our trucks too. Without wasting a moment, we gathered what little we could and fled the cabin. The drive back to civilization was a blur of fear and urgency. Each of us could have had a scope on our foreheads at any moment, or so we felt at the time. The quicker we got out of there, the better. We pushed down the dirt back roads as quickly as we could. When we finally made it out to the nearest town, we found the first payphone and called the authorities. By the time we all made it back to the cabin, it was almost daylight. The authorities combed the area, but they found nothing. Their theory was that someone had been hiding, stalking us from the woods, watching our movements. They had taken out Mike, and while we searched for him, they ransacked the cabin. But who they were, what they wanted, and why they targeted us remained a mystery. The case went cold, and the culprits were never found. Knowing that someone could still be out there took our peace of mind, and trips to the cabin became fewer and further between. Now, years later, I still venture into the woods. I'm more cautious, though, more aware of the subtle sounds and movements of the forest. That experience back in '87 changed the way I see the wilderness. It's not just a place of beauty and solitude. It's also a place where the wicked can lurk just beyond the next tree. Story 2. Dug myself into a hole. Ever since I was a boy, the outdoors has been a place where I felt free and at peace. So naturally, a 3-day solo camping trip in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. During the first 2 days, I immersed myself in all that nature had to offer. Fishing in the glassy creek at dawn, tracking deer along the mossy banks, and at night, falling asleep under the stars. The simplicity of these days filled me with a sense of completeness that only nature could provide, setting my mind at ease for what I expected to be a routine trek out on the 3rd day. After spending the morning lingering in the quiet of the forest, I got a late start on my walk out. The path was familiar, one I had traversed many times before, and I was confident I could navigate it even as dusk approached. With about 30 minutes left to go, the battery in my light sputtered out, plunging me into darkness. It wasn't anything to worry about, though. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, and the moonlight was more than sufficient to illuminate the last stretch before arriving at my car. A few minutes after my light went out, I stopped to rest my legs and grab a snack from my pack. The night was still, broken only by the crunch of my granola bar and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. It was in this moment of calm that I felt completely at one with the wild. As I sat on a fallen log, sipping water and enjoying the solitude, a faint, irregular sound caught my attention. It was distant but distinct, the sound of metal hitting earth. Curiosity piqued, I decided to investigate, thinking maybe some fellow hikers or wildlife enthusiasts were also out and about. I veered off the trail, moving towards the sound. As I got closer, the sounds became clearer. There were 2 distinct shovels digging into the soil. My heart rate picked up. Who would be digging in the middle of nowhere at this ungodly hour? I crept closer, using the trees as cover, until I could see them. 2 men, dressed in dark clothing, shovels in hand, digging a hole in a small clearing. There was something unnerving about the scene. They worked in silence, with an urgency that signaled that they didn't want to be seen doing whatever it was that they were doing. I hid behind a large tree, watching them. My mind raced with possibilities. Were they burying something? Or someone? The thought made my stomach turn. I considered turning back, but my curiosity, and perhaps a sense of moral responsibility, held me in place. Suddenly, one of the men stopped digging and stood upright, scanning the surrounding woods like a predator. He whispered something to his companion, who also paused and looked around. I realized, with a jolt of fear, that they were being diligent to ensure that they weren't being watched. I stayed as still as possible, holding my breath. They resumed digging, but now with more haste. I decided I had seen enough, and slowly began to retreat, planning to contact the authorities as soon as I got out of the woods. But as I took a step back, a branch snapped under my foot, loud in the silence of the night. Terror shot through my body like a bolt of lightning. How could I have been so careless? The digging stopped. I froze. The men turned in my direction, and for a moment, we were all motionless. Then, with a terrifying speed, as if instinct took over, they dropped their shovels and started towards me. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest became a blur as I sprinted, dodging trees and leaping over underbrush. I could see their lights bouncing in the distance, their footsteps and voices getting closer. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline fueling my flight. As the men gave chase, my instinct for survival took over. I darted off the path into the shadowy woods and found a dense thicket to conceal myself. Heart still hammering, I waited, barely able to breathe as the sounds of their footsteps got closer and closer. In a small yet meaningful burst of relief, the men's voices and crunching footsteps passed by my hiding spot, oblivious to my presence. I remained still in the forest's obscurity until their figures returned in the moonlight, heading back towards the ominous hole they had left. Only when their presence had once again faded into the forest's distance did I dare to leave my hiding spot. With the path now clear, I broke into a desperate run, pushing through the pain and fear, all the way back to my car. Safely inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove straight to the nearest police station to report the harrowing encounter. The police searched the woods, but found no one. The hole that had been dug was empty, and there were no clues as to who the men were or what their intentions had been. It was clear that there was something in that hole that the men did not want anyone to see. Their aggression was a testament to that. That night was one of the scariest nights of my life. Everything happened so fast. The forest, which had always been a place of solace and retreat, now holds a hint of menace and mystery to it. Something I wish I could shake. Story 3. Campfire in the Distance. Years ago, I decided to embark on a hiking trip through the Ouachita Mountains. I was 26 at the time, confident in my outdoor skills, and ready for a few days of privacy and nature. I could never have anticipated how that journey would turn into a crazy story of survival and fear. The first day was everything I had hoped for. The Ouachita's sprawling beauty was mesmerizing, with towering trees and the distant calls of wildlife. I found a perfect spot to set up camp as the evening approached, near a large, oddly shaped rock that jutted out from the ground like it had been there for thousands of years. That night, I fell asleep to the symphony of the woods, feeling completely at ease. The tranquility, however, didn't last long. I awoke early the next morning to a disconcerting discovery. Surrounding my tent were footprints, large, heavy, and unmistakably human. They circled my campsite, meandering off into the dense underbrush. My heart skipped a beat upon first finding them. Who else was out here, and why had they been lurking around my tent while I slept? Trying to shake off my unease, I decided to press on with my hike. But as the day wore on, I was on high alert. Every snapped twig or rustle in the underbrush sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The footprints made it clear that I wasn't alone, and I felt it necessary to keep my guard up. As dusk approached, I contemplated making my way back to civilization, but pride and the fading daylight convinced me to set up camp again, this time in a more concealed location. That night, as I sat by my campfire, the forest seemed more alive and more menacing than before. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the eerie silence. Then, something in the distance caught my eye. Another campfire, flickering faintly through the trees. I scurried to put out my own fire as quickly as possible, hoping to conceal my presence. As curiosity overcame my initial fear, I decided to approach the other campfire, not really knowing what to think. As I neared, the light from the fire illuminated a figure sitting by it. It was a man, large and imposing, his back turned to me. Something about his posture, tense and alert, gave me a bad feeling. As I sat and watched for a minute, suddenly, the man stood and turned to his right towards a pile of firewood. As he took a step towards it, he turned his head and our eyes met. At first he was taken aback, like he was surprised. But as the gears in his head turned and he began to process that there was a stranger in the woods spying on him, his expression changed, and his eyes became aggressive, boring into mine with an intensity that I can't even describe. "What the hell?" the man exclaimed in a booming voice. In my panic, I scrambled backwards and took off. As I ran, the thicket grew denser, branches scratching at my face and arms, but I didn't slow down. Suddenly a gunshot rang out, the sound violently reverberating through the woods, heightening my terror to an almost unbearable level. Behind me, the man's heavy footsteps were joined by a deep, bellowing voice. He was yelling something incomprehensible, a jumble of words that I couldn't quite make out over my own panting breath, and the ominous echo of the gunshot still ringing in the air. My mind raced as I dashed through the woods, desperately seeking escape. Ahead, I spotted a small ravine, its edges obscured by underbrush. Without a second thought, I slid down its slope, my hands clawing at the dirt to slow my descent. The ravine provided a natural cover, and I crouched down, trying to steady my breathing. From my hiding place, I could hear the man's shouts growing distant. He was still searching, but he was moving away from my location. I waited, every muscle tensed, listening for any sign that he was doubling back. The minutes stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. I was in a predicament now. I'd followed the light of the man's campfire upon approach, but now that I needed to get back to my own campsite, I couldn't do so without turning on my flashlight and giving away my position. If I tried to navigate my way back in the dark, I would have gotten lost for sure. I chastised myself for letting my curiosity walk me into such a harrowing situation. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours. As the first light of dawn started creeping through the trees, I finally mustered the courage to climb out of the ravine. I made my way back to my campsite, packed up my gear with shaking hands, and didn't stop moving until I reached the safety of my car. I never found out who the man was. For all I know, he was just minding his own business, and I intruded into his campsite. But then again, I pondered over the footprints that I found in my own campsite that first night. Was this the man that had paid me a visit? If not, then who did and what were they up to? I left the woods with more questions than answers, the mystery of the man and the footprints around my tent unresolved. I couldn't shake the feeling of being stalked that first night, but in the same breath, I was disappointed in myself for being the one to do the stalking in the end. Lots of lessons were learned that weekend, and in the weeks and months to come, I spent a lot of time reassessing my understanding of the delicate balance between adventure and caution